Hey everybody, it's Amit. We're going to do the critique topic analysis for debate drills. Basically, in this topic analysis, I'm going to be going over some ways about how to think of the resolution a little bit more critically from a bunch of different perspectives, questioning a lot of different assumptions, and hopefully this gives you a better insight into what positions you can run that are K-friendly, sort of on the affirmative and the negative, and inspires a little bit more of a different thought process when you're dealing with going through research and trying to find different K positions. So the first thing we're going to start off is with our AF arguments. So the first thing that we're going to focus on is Peace Corps, which I think is some of the core AF ground on this topic. This is usually going to be a soft left structural violence AF, but the Peace Corps is a part of national service. The other part is AmeriCorps, and one of the parts is Peace Corps, which is a volunteer program run by the United States government. The stated mission of the Peace Corps include providing technical assistance, helping people outside the United States to understand American culture, and helping Americans to understand the cultures of other countries. So the Peace Corps basically gets volunteers who go to the Peace Corps and say that they want to learn more about different types of cultures. They don't want to just be Americentric, and they want to see different types of experiences outside the United States. So the Peace Corps is run by the United States government and actually allows these volunteer programs to go to different places and see these different type of cultures, which usually allows a lot of technical assistance in those cultures to help them with things that they need to do. It also states that volunteers work with government, schools, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and entrepreneurs in education, business, information technology, agriculture, and the environment as a part of national service. The way I think this can be run as a KF is sort of, you're going to have to deal with a T debate if you don't defend a lot of the military service aspects of national service, but at the point where you can beat the T debate, you have a very good advantage that is simply dealing with cultural competency. And sort of you can make the argument that it should be compulsory that every person in the United States goes to other countries, leaves their Western way of thought, and sees the world in a different perspective that allows us to change and have a different reformulation of how we think about the world. I think there's a lot of literature out there in terms of cultural competency that will be uploaded to the Dropbox and the article sections as well. But a lot of that stuff can really be gained as a nice education advantage for the affirmative. The second thing that I think is really cool about the Peace Corps app is the environment argument. And I think that if you can make the argument that Peace Corps allows people to go to different types of countries and even just in the United States and clean up environments, this can link to a very good climate change argument and how climate change affects the urban populations and minorities and low-income people of color the most in the United States and writ large throughout the entire world. But also it can lead to an extinction argument, just a general link chain about how climate change leads to extinction and how Peace Corps is necessary to reduce it. So I think this is your basic soft left structural violence AF. You might have to deal with the T debate, or you might defend whole res and just outweigh against a lot of the disad impacts to armed corps, which is the military part of national service. But in general, I think this is a really good 1AC and a basic stock 1AC to gain just decent sort of advantages that deal with helping other people in other countries. The second one is a little bit more critical. I thought of this AF immediately when I heard the resolution, and I thought it was just really funny, to be honest. So this is a Baudrillard affirmative. If you don't know a lot about Baudrillard, that's fine. I suggest reading an article called Pumpkin Spice Latte. Type that into Google and type in criticaltheory.com. You'll learn a lot about the simulation and simulacra stuff that Baudrillard talks about in terms of how media representations change the way in which we think about the world. But one of Baudrillard's fundamental arguments is that there is a machine that needs to be combusted in sort of how the media accentuates what we know about the world. So one cool way to combust the machine, quote unquote, is to fill the machine with desires and all the unnecessary sort of sarcastic things the machine needs, like more military members, more spending, more nuclear weapons, like we don't already have enough, to one day combust the machine. And this is sort of a little bit of a tricky argument, but it's essentially a parody argument that systems and structures of power and hegemony will eventually collapse if they get too much power. and it's attached to the Baudrillard's theory of hyperreality that allows us to understand how certain things need more fuel in order to collapse. So one main argument that the AF can just go for is set up the harms, as in militarism is bad, militarism affects, a culture of disposability, etc., 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 and attach it to the Baudrillardian theory of hyperreality and stimulation and simulacra, and then the advocacy should just be like, we should compulsively deconstruct the military by forcing millions of Americans into the military, which will reduce spending for all of the programs that we need. Like, we're going to, instead of spending on education and healthcare reform and things like that, we're going to go into the military. We're going to buy more nuclear weapons. We're going to stop people from getting jobs that innovate different types of technology to save us, right? To have energy like renewable energy. People are not going to be working in those jobs because now they're going to be forced to do national service. You're basically impact turning every intuitive reason for why spending in the military would be bad and why it would be bad to force millions of people into the military to ultimately lead to the impact which would solve the root cause of a lot of the disads that people would read, which is destroying the military entirely. So your alternative wants to win your AF wants to win a couple of root causes about the militaristic culture and Baudrillardian theory, sort of describing the way in which the world is constructed. And if you can win that you combust the machine, you sort of win that you deconstruct all those impacts in the long run. The short-term trade-off is obviously the AF would be like, you force all these people, or the neg would be like, you force all these people, these marginalized people, to join the military. That's bad. Your argument would be like, this is a short-term trade-off for a eventually long-term sort of good world that we would exist without the military if we combusted. And your main warrant for this, or like sort of weighing argument, is that a lot of the violence that the marginal people will face that the that the neg wants to talk about is inevitable eventually because of sort of the systems of power that are in place. So it literally becomes try or die for the affirmative. And yeah, I think that can be a good affirmative. I don't know how strong this affirmative be or how often this affirmative will be run, but I do think it is worth looking into and creating in the first place, just to see if judges are sort of intuitively understanding this type of theory and how it affects a lot of the disads that would intuitively say spending and extinction are bad things. So the next AF that I thought about is a AF about masculinity. So this is essentially an argument saying that it is sort of discriminatory to only let men join the military and young boys, because it says that these men are the ones who are supposed to uphold the masculine norms of protecting the country and being the barriers of the nation. Women and other genders should be given access to this, because if they're not given access to this, it upholds a patriarchal culture in only which men have the ability to protect the country, when at many times nationalism and patriotism is also connected to other genders and types of people who also want to protect the country. So this occurs with making things compulsory, which would eventually deconstruct masculinity in the military, because your thesis claim would be that if other genders and other groups of identities ultimately infiltrate the military, it would destroy toxic masculinity in terms of how the military is constructed. The problems with this affirmative is that a lot of queer, trans, feminism sort of studies indicate that the military-industrial complex is part of what they're criticizing. So they would encourage that it is wrong for women, or not even that is wrong, but it is unsafe for women, trans, and queer people to, or even people of color, to be inside the military because the military is abusive to them. For example, there's a lot of literature about sexual assault in the military, which is why it would be bad sort of to force women in there. This one is he would have to weigh on a couple of root cause claims and have a really good solvency advocate that indicates, primarily by someone who identifies as a woman, that indicates if women go into the military, there is a very big chance of solving and deconstructing how masculinity is infiltrated into the norms of the military. There also is an argument to be made that the military bombs other countries and feels like it needs to, boast its testosterone, basically because men are the people running the military. If women and other identities were to enter that space, there would be the potentiality of it to ultimately decrease or potentially change from how it is structured now. That root cause claim in terms of how masculinity controls how the military operates in terms of bombs and interventionism would have to be won by the affirmative in order to win that argument. So I think this is a good affirmative. I think it has a couple problems in terms of just like why the military is bad in the status quo. So a good solvency opposite and a lot of weighing in terms of the root cause debate would have to be necessary in order to win this affirmative. The next affirmative that I thought about is an affirmative about reparations. So when I thought about national service, I thought about what it means to serve the nation and how that enacts the idea of giving something back to your country. So one argument is that white people should serve the nation by giving reparations. And the reason to giving reparations is an article we'll get into later when I go to the next side of the critique, TA. But essentially that black people have served the nation for 400 years, right? They have given their lives, generations of wealth inequality. They've given everything up essentially to serve the military, yet there has been no real structural change in their position in the military, or not even in the military, in the country writ large. So your argument is that white people should serve the nation by giving reparations. Obviously, the national service definition would have to be more creatively defined, and you would have to obviously deal with the T debate. But if you can win that we should reject Eurocentric definitions and we should think of the world in a different way, then you could win that national service means white people serving the nation by giving reparations. The reason black people are not a part of the nation, or the reason it can't be compulsory for black people is because they are not part of the nation. And this is where you would make a traditional Afro-pessimist argument that black people have no agency, no rationality, no thesis claim to be a part of a country that has structurally sort of opposed them to the ways in which they operate. So your argument would just be like, the black people cannot give reparations because they are not part of the nation. They were stripped of their nationhood when they were stolen from Africa and brought to America, which means the only remedy to this is white people serving the nation by giving reparations, and that should be compulsory. That's a really strong argument. I thought it has a lot of impacts. I think it's pretty cool. Some of the kinks that it has, though, are not the best thing. So one argument is that what about all the other people in the country who are not black or white? I think this would fall prey to that argument because if there's other people in the country who are not black and white, for example, Asians and Latinx folk and all these other immigrants that immigrated to the United States around in the 40s and 30s, what responsibility do they have of having reparations be compulsory? And this argument is actually one of the problems with this affirmative that I think could be remedied in two ways. One, either there are degrees of citizenship that these people also do not meet, i.e. they also have to deal with structural disenfranchisement, the model minority, things like that, which would protect them from being a part of the nation in terms of the definitional aspect. So you would win that these people are also not a part of the nation. America is a Caucasian white nation. There's no melting pot to it. They shouldn't be giving reparations. They should be receiving the benefits of those reparations. Or do they also pay reparations as well? And I think this argument is one of the more less intuitive of those, but there is a lot of literature about Asian anti-blackness and Latinx anti-blackness and anti-blackness being a global phenomenon that is infiltrated in other groups of identities, especially in the United States. Do they give reparations as well? So I think that's the one question that this affirmative has to answer. My default argument would be to go to degrees of citizenship in which people don't have to pay reparations as well because they're also not part of the country, and America is purely Eurocentric in its geographical sort of and demographical way of operations. But that's one of the problems with this affirmative, even though I think this affirmative is a good idea. So that's one of the things that we'll have to fix and sort of thought about in order to read it in a better way. So here are some neg arguments. I think there are some other affirmative arguments before we move on to the neg that just have to deal with criticisms of the idea of compulsory in general. You can make a non-topical KF and just not care sort of about fiating the resolution. Obviously, you're going to have to deal with the framework debate in terms of defending like hypothetical implementation and things like that. Obviously, if you can be good at impact turning that, there's a debate to be won. But the three KFs I mentioned about masculinity, Peace Corps, and reparations, I think are the strongest three KFs at the moment. And, in the next couple of days with more research, with more reading, I'm pretty sure there's going to be more affirmative critical arguments that will happen. But Peace Corps is one that should definitely be cut immediately just because that's core aft ground. And then the rest of the arguments that default from that will get a little more critical, consequentialist in different realms. So, neg arguments. So some things to think about before we immediately dive into that is, one, what does it mean for something to be compulsory? I think a lot of Enlightenment and analytical philosophers and continental postmodernist philosophers would disagree with the idea of forcing people to do something that sort of violates, Kantian human agency, and that also brings up the question about why should marginalized people be forced to do something for a nation that, is not nice to them, essentially, is very hostile and violent to them. So the idea of compulsory, I think, is very, very important when we're thinking of neg critical ground, around, because the fundamental assumption behind compulsory is that there is a duty or obligation for something to be done, which is why it must be forced, which is why we had the compulsory voting topic a couple of years ago, which was just like people have the duty to vote. They need to operate in a democratic society, and the assumption behind compulsory was that voting is a good thing that reaches some type of good end. The other thing is questioning the status of nationhood. What does it mean to be a part of the nation? What does it mean to view the nation as something that is acceptable for ourselves, and to be a part of a country that, may not be the best for other groups of people. Nationalism is also another thing to think about, right? What precedent does serving in the military or serving the nation serve in terms of how the rest of the world views the United States? Obviously, the Holocaust was a brutal reality and the impact of what nationalism would ultimately, happen, how nationalism would be affected in different ways. But that's also another assumption to think about in the resolution when the term national service comes out. Finally, serving the nation is necessary for what reasons? I think this is also something that is important, because if you pinpoint what specific reasons it's necessary for to serve the nation, you get sort of a better basis about some of the hidden tactics about why the nation needs to be served in the first place, or why that would be a good thing. So, the first one in C we have are reparations. Again, I think this is an AF argument. It can be read on the neg. On the neg, I think it's a lot better. Your argument would be that black people have already served the nation via slavery. So your alternative, your links would just be like national service is not good for black people because they've served the nation. Impact, forcing black people to serving the nation, justifies sort of the violence that they have underwent throughout slavery. Instead of continuously serving the nation, white people should pay up, which is your alternative. The Atlantic.com, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes a really good article. You'll be able to click on this link when you guys see the PowerPoint. I think everyone should cut that article as well for this critique. It's a pretty decent critique. Your argument is just that, white people should pay reparations. That's how they should serve the nation. It's obviously mutually exclusive from the affirmative, because the affirmative would uphold the prison industrial complex, which would be, a disad to the alternative. There's no way you can serve reparations and uphold that complex. But second of all, your argument is just like, you force black people to serve the nation. Our link argument is that they have already served the nation, so this is how they should be rewarded for that, essentially. I think a very stock critique, a basic critique on this topic, but nonetheless, I think it is a very strong critique that can be run and really impact turn a lot of util affirmatives that try to say that serving the nation could protect America, because your argument would be like America shouldn't be protected because of what it's done to black people via slavery. The next critique that I think is actually very good on this topic is neoliberalism. The basis of neoliberalism and capitalism is the military-industrial complex. The military creates a culture of disposability, which hurts other bodies, makes them seem as objects, which leads them closer to death. Making it mandatory only fuels the system. And this is a bad thing, right? If we make it mandatory for people to join the military, not only are people forced into a militaristic culture in which they do not want to be a part of, they don't want to serve the military, which you can gain from very basic stock links, but B, if all of our spending goes to the military, it trades off with education, healthcare, things that are innovative for people to survive, which is a unique internal link to knowledge production. If we're not spending money on education and helping urban and poor communities, and we're spending it on fueling the military and fueling the United States hegemony, it only sustains our knowledge production that creates the school to prison pipeline, which destroys any potentiality of radical thought. So I think Henry Giroux, again, he's a basic author on neoliberalism debates, and most of LD should know him, but he is an amazing author when it comes to the idea of how teachers and students interact in the classroom and what it means to have critical pedagogy. The argument would be that if we fuel the military-industrial complex with millions of people, we're not spending that money that needs to be on education, so sort of the link to your spending disad would now come to the neolib critique and become more critical, and that results in a knowledge production that is sustained throughout American culture that needs money in order to be created, right? There needs to be more money invested into students of color, invested into urban communities, invested into low-income communities that need to think about the world differently, and that money is going to create more nuclear weapons. That trade-off, I think, is your best link in the neoliberalism critique. All the impacts would be, creates a hyper-militarized state, creates more state-sanctioned violence, creates a culture of disposability, right? A lot of all that stuff. You can get imperialism impacts because that's connected to neoliberalism. The impact debate will be very easy to do on this critique. The link debate, I think, is what has to be nuanced and separated from basic capitalism critiques. And then your alternative can be just, one, we're not going to, have compulsory stuff, compulsory national service, because that's a bad thing. But B, we'll do a structural analysis on why the military is the way it is and how it sustains itself via neoliberalism. And your alternative would be creating a different educational model that is valued upon critical pedagogy, not on fueling the industrial complex that creates a facade of what we understand as real knowledge production and radical knowledge production. So I think the neolib K is probably one of the best Ks on this topic as well. The next one would be a feminism critique about why conscription is bad. So conscription in the context of women assumes that more women is a good thing in the military, that they should be on an equal playing field, that more people should be in the military because it'll, increase the chances of equality. This is some of the stuff that happened when Trump banned trans people from being in the military, and a lot of radical trans authors were just like, thank you, right? We don't want to be in the military industrial complex. We don't want to serve this nation. There are obviously some trans scholars who are like, no, this is wrong, right? We should have equal rights. But a lot of the radical trans scholars were just like, this is a amazing thing. We should not be forced to serve in this country, given how this country operates. So that can be some of your link arguments. I think another link argument could just be that sexual assault in the military is well documented and very real. And if you forced women to go into the military, if the military is as masculine as we believe it is to be, more quote unquote like identifying women body, the actual bodies, the actual physical number of women in the military will not stop the culture of patriarchy that is sustained upon them. So it's like, yeah, we got 5 more women, but all of them were sexually assaulted because of toxic masculinity within the military. So your argument would be that patriarchy doesn't go away if women just get the same rights, because the military is inherently masculine and it's good for women to not have to join. This is a good case neg against for critical affirmatives that want to go for the masculinity deconstruction advantage. You would just take it one step further to the left and be like, no, masculinity needs to be broken down through thought experiments and critical structural analyses of the military, and in conjunction with masculinity, not forcing non-male identifying bodies into the military, because that will not produce any productive results that actually leads to an impact that is productive. So I think this is also a good basic K. Again, I think this K also impact turns a lot of util advantages, because if all of the advantages in these policy arguments rely upon specific groups of identities being forced to be abused and sustained in a culture that is so violent towards them, then you're probably going to get away with a good enough of a decent analysis about why we should reject the military in its entirety. The next neg I thought about was ableism. I think this is a pretty easy negative argument that some people simply are not physically or socially able to fight in the military. Simply because, they may not have the physical capacity or the social strength to actually get up and go into the military. The military requires specific norms in order to fight within it, right? You need to have a working body that is able to do the things that society says is able-bodied. And I think your criticism of that would be that the 1AC sort of overlooks the internal and external problems within someone who is disabled or someone who is differently able that cannot attempt to resolve or alleviate a lot of the problems that the military wants to go. Making it compulsory forces people with disabilities to be in the military, which again you can link to a lot of impacts for why that's bad, and your alternative again can be why we should have a disability pedagogy versus a militaristic pedagogy. Again, I think a lot of these critiques rely on picking one marginalized group of people and attaching their literature base, i.e. ableism, feminism, racism, to the resolution. But the reason I think all of these critiques are cohesive with each other is because they come from the starting point that these specific identities don't have an obligation to serve a nation, the nation being the United States of America, that does not do anything to serve them. And if you can win that thesis claim when you're negative, I think it's very easy to win a link and eventually a reason why the alternative can solve the case. The next one I see is homonationalism. I'll go over this briefly because we talked about this on the fem section, but nationalism in the context of LGBTQ plus people is violent. It overlooks homophobia in regards for Western society to be seen as inclusive. So we get things like gay marriage, and we get things like, equal access to businesses for gay owners, but that overlooks the fact that there's a structure of violence that destroys their ability to actually be seen as a human, which is an author named Poor talks about, and we'll upload that article as well. So this argument is just like trans people should not go to the military because that is homonationalist. That assumes that if we allow the LGBT community to go into the military, that there will be some sort of representation, when there will only be inherent violence against these people, which will inevitably be bad. So I think this is also another critique that attacks one concept and looks at it from a critical lens, which allows you to gain some more argumentation for why that's a bad thing. So here's the final thing I'll talk about, which is the alternatives I think are best for the critiques that you read on the negative. The best alts are some structural analysis of how the military affects the group of people you're talking about, along with how the military creates a culture of disposability. These alternatives should be attached to a lot of cards in your 1 and C about why education is important. I think the K proper itself will be very short. A lot of the framing arguments you're going to be needing to make on the negative critique aspect of this topic is about why education comes first before all other impacts. The second thing is you're going to have to reject the idea of national service being a good thing, since it questions a prior truth about why the nation serves people correctly. So one, you have a structural analysis about what people you're talking about, but two, you're also talking about why the national service proper is good, since it questions a truth or a assumption about why the nation serves people in the context of what the affirmative would think it does serve, which again is your main util impact turn argument for why those things are ethical. Finally, the alternative usually solves the harms and impacts of the AF if you win the military causes those harms in the first place, and attach that root cause argument to a lot of the bodies of literature that you're talking about that I think can be strongly applied in this context as well. And that's what I think the main alternative and role of the ballot debates can center around, just given that there is a strong analysis towards how that creates a structure of disposability and a culture of disposability attached to a lot of the literature you're talking about in regards to other, marginalized bodies and things like that. There are two critiques that I did not talk about, and this is because I'm doing a lot of more research on them to see if they're applicable to the resolution. One is Deleuze, and second is Baudrillard. So for Deleuze, a basic claim you can make is that fluid identity is not compatible in the world of the affirmative, simply because if you make something compulsory, you destroy the ability for that individual to become and develop relationships outside of the military or outside of the state, as the state being like the biopolitical structure that controls the military. I think that argument is good. There is a little bit more research I need to do in the context of if that's coherent with a lot of the other arguments that D and G talk about. So that analysis or that little article or my thoughts on that will be up on the Dropbox very soon. But the basic thesis claim on Deleuze, I think, is that compulsory makes a static identity, which inevitably leads to the pitfalls that Deleuze and Guattari talk about in terms of becoming identities that are different from the abstract norms that society enforces on individuals. In terms of Baudrillard, I think there is an argument to be made about why forcing people to join the military creates a stimulation of a human being that goes through the stimulation process and inevitably comes out as just an object that is used to serve the country. I think fascism and a lot of that fascism literature can delve in really well with a lot of the stimulation simulacra stuff Baudrillard talks about in order to create sort of a thesis claim that it is wrong to make it compulsory because that hides systems of violence and that destroys the basic media representation that we see when we think about the military and turns it into a normalized culture of millions of people being forced to go into national service as soon as they turn 18 with no potentiality of their life to be different or of their life to be seen as something else than other than being a military member. So yeah, a lot of that literature will be up on the Dropbox soon as well. The reason there wasn't a slide for Baudrillard and Deleuze is because their theories are just very, very complex, and it takes a lot of reading to understand what they're talking about before you can just give a 2 to 3 minute explanation about their theory. So once those articles go up, I encourage everyone to read those articles and then ask me a lot of questions in terms of what they think the analysis can be in the context of the resolution. But those are my main thoughts on the critique part of this topic analysis. I hope you guys all are influenced to read a lot more. I know that so far there are a lot of articles on the Dropbox in terms of the critical literature that you guys can go to. But basically, those are my thoughts on the resolution, how we can critically interpret it. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of more critical affirmatives and negatives coming in the future. So thank you guys for watching. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you guys.